And while you guys are doing that, I'll just tell you what happened to me this morning. This morning I was going to go and review my talk, and just to, get it fresh in my mind and maybe modify a couple things or whatever. And went to turn on my computer, and the computer wouldn't turn on. And that's never happened with this computer before. It just wouldn't turn on. The little on button was lighted up. It was on. The keyboard was on. I could turn the lights on for the keyboard and off and all that stuff. But the screen wouldn't turn on. And so worked on it for about 10 minutes, trying all kinds of different things, and it wasn't working. So then I flipped it over and I took it all apart. I took the back off and I unplugged different wires and plugged them back in, and lights came off and on and off, and still nothing was working. Right? So then Sigrid and the boys and I, we had a little prayer for the computer, and then I pressed the button again, and the button went off. And that was something different. So then we pressed it again, and it came on, and the computer came on. So now the boys, Wesley and Bradley, think that I'm a computer genius. Of course, that's not true. But anyway, it came on, so it's working. Otherwise, I guess I could give it by memory, but the slides are really cool. So there's a bunch of them, so I'd like you to see what's going on. So anyway, the science of faith, and I'd like to start out with one of my favorite scientists, Isaac Newton, who had quite a bit to say about science and faith. And he said, "He who thinks half-heartedly will not believe in God, but he who really thinks has to believe in God." So if you're kind of superficial thinker, you might come to the conclusion that there is no God. But if you really take thinking seriously, like Isaac Newton did, according to him, if you really think hard about it, you have to conclude that there is a God. And he even said, in the absence of any other proof, I thought that was kind of cool. He says, "My thumb alone would convince me that the God exists." Just looking at your thumb would convince me, at least for him, all the mechanics and intricacies of just the thumb by itself would convince him that there is a God. And Newton was actually quite an arrogant man, so it's quite interesting that he said this sort of the things that he said. But he is only arrogant in respect to other people. In respect to God, he wasn't so arrogant. He also talked about the system of the sun, the planets, and the comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. And as far as Newton's humility, he actually was a humble man when he thought about God. He says, "I don't know what I may appear to the world, but to myself I seem to have only been like a boy playing on the seashore, and diverting myself now and then, finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay undiscovered before me." So, thank you for reading the text, Laura Lee, and especially that version. I like that as well. It says, "But be prepared." I mean, don't just say, "because I have faith." When someone walks up to you, you say, "Why are you one of them crazy Christians?" This happened to me when I was in the Army. They actually asked me exactly that way. "Why are you one of those crazy Christians?" Because we know the Bible is just a bunch of fairy tales, and it's just because, evolution is true. How can you be a doctor and think of yourself as interested in science and be a Christian? And at that point in my life, I really didn't know. I didn't really have this advice well ingrained within me because I didn't really know how to answer them. But at that point, I was like, I'd better take this more seriously and say, why do I believe what I believe? And I started looking into the reasons. And at first, I was really kind of nervous because when you approach something and you don't know why you have done something your whole life and you think you may have to stop doing that, it makes you a bit nervous. But when I started actually researching it and studying it, why do I believe what I believe? First time in my life, really, because I grew up in the church. My dad's a pastor, and I just kind of took it for granted, right? But when you get to a certain age and people start asking you questions and you can't answer them, you start to take these questions a bit more seriously for yourself. So when I started finding answers to these questions, I got a bit excited, and I started writing them down. And eventually, somebody told me, "You need to put this on the internet." I was like, "How do I do that?" So I learned so much doing this. I find out how to open a website and do all these cool things and sharing it with people. And then people ask me to kind of speak on it. And so that's kind of why I ended up doing this sort of thing. So you need to be prepared to give a reason for the hope that's in you. And it's not any good, and it wasn't any good for me when I was a kid, when you ask your parents why they do something and they say, because I told you so, right? That's just not a good reason, right? You need to get a reason that's rational and not just because I said so or because the Bible said so even. Well, why did the Bible said so? You know, kids keep asking why, and eventually you have to come up with a good reason or they're just going to keep asking why, right? So this is interesting because people who don't take the Bible seriously, who believe it's a bunch of fairy tales, this is what they say. They say religion is a culture of faith, science is a culture of doubt, right? So this is Richard Feynman. He's a well-known American theoretical physicist, Nobel Prize winner, and this is the reason why he accepts science and not faith. Because faith, you just believe blindly, whereas at least in science, that you can have some doubts, right? So what's the answer to that? What is faith? Is faith just a blind faith because I said so, or because the Bible said so, or because God said so? Does God just say, just believe me because I said so, or does he offer some evidence? And so what is faith? According to Hebrews 11:1, he says that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. It just doesn't say because I said so. So what is the evidence for things unseen? Well, faith is kind of like Wi-Fi. I kind of like this. I was searching around for definitions of faith and I came across this. Wi-Fi is invisible, but a lot of teenagers would be completely lost without it. Right? Right? So it's just what you need. Right? And the Bible talks about this evidence too. The disciples were completely hopeless when Jesus died. They were quivering in fear, hiding in this room. The doors locked. They didn't want to see anybody. They thought they were next, right? They were terrified. They were lily-livered, chicken-hearted. They were not brave at all, right? And so then when they found out that Jesus was resurrected, and they actually saw him and touched him and ate with him, then they suddenly became brave. Why? It's because they gained true faith. The evidence for their faith became solid at that point. And Paul talks about this. He says, if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. Right? It's craziness is all it is without the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus' resurrection was the turning point in the history of the Bible. It's the basis for where we are now. And even Anthony Flew. Anthony Flew was a famous atheist, a skeptic, and he was very well known, especially in the 1950s. He wrote this book about why you shouldn't believe in God. And then later he became a deist. He believed finally the evidence was enough to at least become there is a God, but he's not a Christian God. He's not personally interested. Except he made this one interesting statement about Christianity. He said, the evidence for the resurrection is better for claimed miracles than in any other religion. It's outstandingly different in quality and quantity. In other words, there's a lot of evidence for the resurrection of Christ outside of the Bible. Even. It's not just because I said so. There were a lot of witnesses that could have said, well, here's the body, guys. You Christians are crazy. Well, that never happened. And everybody who said that they saw Jesus raised from the dead, they all put their lives on the line. They were all martyred for it except for John. And they tried to kill John too, except he just wouldn't boil in oil. He just kind of was sitting there rubbing. This is a lovely bath, right? He just wouldn't boil. And so they put him on this island and he died of old age. But everybody else died a martyr's death. And you don't do that if you know that what you're saying is actually a lie. They actually believed what they were saying about the resurrection. And this is the reason why we're here today. But on the other hand, we also have to be rational in our thinking. If you want to give a reasonable reason for your faith, it's like Galileo. I like this phrase from Galileo. He said, I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with sense, reason, and intellect has intended us to forego their use. In other words, turn off your brain when you enter church, right? No, when we come into church, it should engage every part of us, including our minds. So what is science? I think that if science is real and it's useful, that God made it, that God intended us to use science as a rational approach to faith. So science is basically using past events to predict the future in a way that the predictions must be testable in a potentially falsifiable manner. In other words, your predictions that you make must be testable so that you could be wrong if your predictions fail. That's how science works. So it's not limited in its ability to detect the existence of the miraculous, because there's a lot of miraculous things that scientists believe that don't make any sense on the face of things. But they still believe it because that's the weight of evidence, right? it's only limited in its ability to explain the miraculous. Sometimes you can't explain what you know is true, kind of like, for men anyway, kind of like women. Right? We know women exist, but we can't explain them all the time, necessarily. So there's this little cartoon here. It says there's all these scientific formulas and facts and everything, and then right in the middle, then a miracle occurs. And a lot of scientists says, well, that's not scientific. But they do the same thing all the time themselves. They just use different terms to describe miracles than we do. But they believe in a lot of stuff that they can't explain, right? So scientific tests of God described in the Bible. There's a bunch of them, but here you got Elijah. He's standing on Mount Carmel, and he has the prophets of Baal. They build an altar. They pray for fire all day long. Nothing happens. And then Elijah prays. He says one simple prayer. All of a sudden, fire comes down from heaven, strikes his altar, and burns it all up, including the water in the trench and all the stones and everything. One of my friends told me that this was just an accidental lightning bolt, right? Who's an atheist. Or that it didn't happen at all, or maybe just a lightning bolt came and it happened. I was like, well, you have to be kind of strong in your atheistic faith to believe that just right away after somebody says a prayer, a lightning bolt comes and hits just exactly the right spot and burns up everything, but doesn't kill anybody else or anything, right? And so that's pretty strong faith you have to have there to believe that that happened. So the other thing is, it's one thing to read the stories in the Bible. It's another thing to test it out for yourself. The Bible says that you need to personally test it for yourself and see that it's true for yourself. Not just somebody else's story, but your own story. Taste and see that it's true. And one test that I've personally done that I recommend that you all do is this verse in Malachi. It talks about tithe and that you need to bring your tithe into the storehouse, your tithe and your offerings. Because if you're not doing so, you're robbing God. But if you do decide to bring the first fruits of your labor and give them to God, that He will give you a blessing. He will open up the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing that you won't be able to receive it. It's not necessarily a monetary blessing, but you'll definitely notice a big change in your life and that you didn't have before. And He said, I will prevent pests from devouring your crops, and vines in your field will not cast their fruit too early, like before they're ripe, says the Lord. And this happens for every part of your life, right? And I've actually tested. There's been people who scientifically tested this. They don't pay tithe for a while, and then they do, right? And you notice a difference. I wouldn't necessarily recommend not doing it for a while because it's not good. But I did do it, and it's not good. Anyway, so just try it out and see. There's this other thing where I've presented this before. You may not have all realized this, but Wesley lost his pocket knife in the middle of the woods walking to this waterfall. And we weren't necessarily we weren't on the trail all the time. He just came to me when it's getting sort of dark, and he says, I lost my pocket knife. Well, I was like, oh, well. And so much for that. You'll have to buy another one with your own money, you know. But Sigrid is more tender-hearted. And so she decided, well, let's pray for the pocket knife. And then what am I going to say to Sigrid? Well, that's just a dumb idea, right? I'm the head elder. I'm not supposed to say that. So I was like, all right, fine. So we all get together. I was like, I did tell her this could work out badly, right? Right, if it doesn't have. But so she was emphatic. We're going to pray for this pocket knife. So we got there, and we were in the middle of nowhere in the grass. And we all pray for the pocket knife, that we will find the pocket knife. And then we say amen, and I go walking on up ahead because it's almost dark. And she looks down on the ground, and the pocket knife is right in front of her on the ground. Right? You may say, well, that was just an accident, right? Well, what are the odds? We're in the middle of nowhere. Anyway, I thought that was pretty cool. Also, Wesley, when he was 4 years old, was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. You probably mostly know about it. And we had him anointed at the church here when he was 5. His colon was like that, looked like hamburger, bleeding, ulcers everywhere. And so we prayed, and nothing happened. We had him anointed, nothing happened. But immediately after we had him anointed, different people came to me with harebrained ideas. And I found unusual research about Crohn's disease that I had no idea about. One of them was a type of fast known as a liquid diet fast. And somebody had come and told me about vitamin D, who was a crazy dermatologist. I had no idea about vitamin D, saying people got better with autoimmune disorders when they took vitamin D. And so we started doing all these different things, and we put him on 12 weeks of liquid diet, this Pediasure only diet. And after 12 weeks, this is more of his bad colon. After 12 weeks, he was feeling a lot better, and we had another colonoscopy, and it was perfectly normal. And Wesley is now 12 years old. This was when he was 5. He hasn't had a single relapse since. And Crohn's disease is chronic. It never gets cured. And a lot of Sigurd's family has Crohn's disease, and they still have problems all the time. Usually there's 2 or 3 flares a year, and you often have to have your colon removed surgically, and it's just bad. And so for Wesley to be 12 years old now and not have a single flare ever since he was anointed, and also a lot of information that we found out that helps other children with Crohn's disease around the world. There's been papers written on this now because of Wesley. I think that's a miracle. So, and you have to try it out for yourself. You have to ask God, what can I do? There's also other things that you can look around. You know that everything, every living thing, including every cell in your body, even the enamel, your teeth, single-cell bacteria, everything functions on a 7-day rhythm, 7-day biorhythm. We didn't know that for about 5 years ago, 6 years ago now. These 7-day cycles, septicircadian rhythms, are found in every living thing that's been studied. And you're just like, well, where did this cycle come from? Well, the biblical critics, because outside of the Bible, there's no reason for a 7-day week, right? People have tried all kinds of 3-day weeks. The Romans had a 10-day week. There's been 5-day weeks, all kinds of things. Even the French tried a 10-day week for a while, but it wasn't very popular, right? So outside of the Bible, though, everybody thought that this came from the Babylonians around 600 BC, and that's because of the base 60 system that they came up with, counting their fingers, and they came up with a base 60 system, and that's where they thought the 7-day week came from. But even that doesn't fit with a base 60 system. It doesn't make any sense. And so now we know that the Bible is backed up by every living thing. 7-day week is programmed into every cell of our body. That's why we take antibiotics for 7 days, because if you do it for any other time, they don't work as well. So these biorhythms, there's even Brazilian bees that, this doesn't happen for every bee, of course, but there's this actual bee colony in Brazil where they don't work on Sabbath, and it happens to be an actual Sabbath. They just stay in their hive, and they take a break. And they don't fly around or do anything. They just hang out in the hive. And then on Sunday, they're back out gathering honey. It's pretty cool. But every living thing does have a 7-day biorhythm that they function best on. If you try to change that rhythm, they don't live as long. They don't do as well. And this may be related to the Blue Zone people. You know, the Seventh-day Adventists are the longest living ethnically diverse people in the world. And why is this? Maybe it's because we take a day off every week, and not just like a lot of people take a Sunday off or a regular day off every week or even a weekend. But we actually take a day off and make it special, like devoted to God, where we separate every secular thought from our minds, at least we're supposed to, and concentrate on God and His nature and relax and rest in Him. And I think this makes a difference when we live according to the biorhythm that He's put inside of us. This is my grandmother at 101, Wesley and Bradley. She got to meet them. So I thought that was pretty cool. She was on Oprah's show about Blue Zone people. It's been in National Geographic, because there's only a few places where people live over 100 years consistently, and we're one of those groups of people. And we're the only ethnically diverse people who does this. There's also prophecy. In fact, prophecy, according to the Bible, is the most sure evidence of the divine origin of the Bible. Peter says, we saw Jesus. We were there. We touched Him. We hang out with Him all this time. We saw the resurrection even. But he says prophecy is a more sure word. He says it's even better evidence than what we saw and what we did. You can read about that in 2 Peter. For example, I'll give you one example. Daniel's prophecies of Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue. They have all these different metals, like the head is made out of gold and it represents Babylon. And we don't know this just because we just came up with it after the fact. There's an angel that showed up and told Daniel, this is what it represents, right? So head of gold equals Babylon, chest of silver, Medo-Persia, belly and thighs made of bronze equal Greece, legs of iron equal Rome, And they were divided in 395 AD. So the division of the legs even is prophetic, because Rome was divided in Eastern Rome and Western empires. Feet of iron and clay, 10 toes. They're post-Rome and modern world, there were actually 10 tribes that took over after Rome fell apart. And then there's beasts that mean the same thing, the same empires. There were beasts, so it's repeated in Daniel. And then you got the little horn that uproots 3 of the kingdoms, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And so the beast, the winged lion, is Neo-Babylon. The lopsided bear with the 3 ribs in its mouth, that's Medo-Persia, who chewed up 3 different countries. And a 4-headed leopard with 4 wings is Greece, because Alexander the Great defeated the region there in record time, very, very rapidly. So that's why the leopard, he's given the symbol of a leopard with wings, so extremely fast. And then the 10-horned beast with iron teeth against the iron, that's Rome again as well. And so this is what Daniel says, Daniel 7. He says, the first was like a lion, and it had wings like an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted up on the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a man, and the heart of a man was given to it. In other words, it was no longer lion-hearted anymore. When Nebuchadnezzar died, the kings that came after him were not like he was. So the lopsided bear, Medo-Persia conquers Lydia, Babylon, and Egypt, adopts the culture and the government of Babylon, and it's larger but less luxurious than Babylon, so it's not the head of gold. It's described as silver. King Cyrus, although Darius the Mede conquers Babylon, he does so under the overall rulership of Cyrus, the Persian king. And this was predicted in Isaiah, hundreds of years before it happened. Names him by name. Cyrus, my shepherd, will accomplish all that I please, blah, 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 blah. It talks about everything that he does. And Cyrus was actually given this prophecy so that he recognized himself in prophecy. So that's that's outside of the Bible, but it's a legend that he was given it. This prophecy about himself, and so he went ahead and did the things that the Bible told that he would do. The rise of Greece, again, extremely rapid. It's also described as an army of bronze, because it's the middle section of bronze, right? And that's just not for any reason. The army was actually clothed in about 100 pounds of bronze. The regular foot soldier had about 100 pounds of bronze. So iron was actually considered a precious metal in iron's day. In Alexander's day, it was used for like necklaces and brooches and things like that. What a lovely iron brooch you have today. So it was bronze that was used for actual weaponry in his day. This was the Battle of Issus, 333 BC. Alexander attacking and winning over the Persian army there, and so he's also described as the goat, the Battle of the he-goats, where Alexander defeats Darius III. Daniel chapter 8 talks about the 2-horned ram that defeats the kings of Persia. The shaggy goat represent Alexander, and the large horn between his eyes was the first king. Alexander defeats Darius 333 at Gaugamela. So it follows history right down the line. And it's very accurate. The Rome kingdom of iron. Rome began to invade the eastern Mediterranean 2nd century BC, and it defeated Greece at the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC and crushed all opposition with iron force in a very dramatic fashion. And then the feet of iron and clay, whereas you saw the iron mixed with miry clay, when they mingle themselves with the seed of men. In other words, they attempted to make alliances by marriage, right? But it never worked out. They still stayed separate kingdoms. But they will not cleave to one another, even as iron does not mix with clay. And this was used as evidence that people like Hitler, for example, would not win the war, the Second World War, because of prophecies like this. And he didn't. So again, more sure word of prophecy that we can count on. There's a bunch of prophecies like this. So what do the skeptics say? Well, they say these prophecies are so accurate. They recognize the accuracy. These prophecies are so accurate they could not have been written in the time of Nebuchadnezzar. They had to have been written down afterward during the time of, later on during the time of the Maccabees, for example. The problem is that all the information was lost right after the time of Nebuchadnezzar. during the Babylonian era. All the information was lost, and when the Greeks took over, they said that Nebuchadnezzar never existed. It was Queen Semiramis who actually created the city of Babylon. So, and this was the popular idea until modern times, until the 1800s. Everybody believed that Queen Semiramis, an Assyrian queen, actually was the one who built Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar himself never existed. Well, then later on, these tablets were found. This is the Nabonidus Cylinder, the father of Nebuchadnezzar, and also a tablet describing his work in the temple of his sun god. And then many cuneiform tablets confirm the building of Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar II, and that Queen Semiramis was an Assyrian queen who reigned as regent for her infant son and had nothing to do with building of Babylon at all. And the Hanging Gardens, everything was described just like the Bible describes it. In fact, once the actual city of Babylon was discovered, they found Nebuchadnezzar's name on every brick in the city, right? So clearly, it was Nebuchadnezzar who built the city of Babylon, and it wasn't this Queen Semiramis. And so that was not discovered until the 1800s. And so you're like, well, it confirms the Bible, and it confirms that nobody would have known except somebody who lived at the time of Nebuchadnezzar all these things that actually happened. So the prophecies have to be written by somebody who lived before they happened. Right? Makes sense? Also, the Ebla tablets, written in 2200 BC, they talk about, it used to be thought that writing did not exist before the time of Moses. But the Ebla tablets predate Moses by hundreds and hundreds of years. And so against these biblical critics are consistently proved wrong over and over again. It also talks about the cities of the plain in the same order that the Bible describes them, Sodom and Gomorrah and all the other cities. And so the archaeological evidence confirms the Bible more and more. In fact, the older and older you get as far as archaeological evidence is concerned, the more and more accurate it confirms the Bible. So the hand without stone comes down and crashes and destroys all the statue in the dream. And so we can have confidence that going forward that God's kingdom will come as described in the Bible. Even though it's not here yet, we can look at the past and see how the past is fulfilled and therefore use it scientifically to predict the future. So what about Darwin? Darwin came along. Before him, pretty much all scientists believed in the Bible to one degree or another, at least the major ones. But Darwin came along and he kind of made belief in the Bible not popular anymore. And so how did he do that? Well, Darwin himself, he was disturbed at the evil he saw in the world. He was upset that cats played with mice and that eggs were laid in caterpillars where they would destroy the caterpillar and things like that. He lost one of his own daughters to scarlet fever. His favorite daughter died of scarlet fever. So he was very upset at the evil he saw in the world. And he couldn't reconcile an evil world with a good God. And so this was kind of what influenced his thinking as he went forward. And it had a dramatic influence not only on himself, but on modern science. William Pervine, professor of biology at Cornell, he said, "Evolution is the greatest engine of atheism that was ever invented. Naturalistic evolution had clear consequences that Charles Darwin understood perfectly. And the consequences are that no gods worth having exist, no life after death exists, no ultimate foundation for ethics exists, no ultimate meaning in life exists, and human free will is non-existent." This is what Darwin believed, and this is what a lot of modern scientists believe. He said, in other words, religion is compatible with modern evolutionary biology, and indeed all of modern science, if religion is effectively indistinguishable from atheism. So you can give lip service to the existence of God all you want, but if you believe in Darwinian evolution, it basically means your idea of God is basically worthless. And I happen to agree. I mean, if you believe that God created through an evolutionary process, it makes God be an evil God anyway. So what's the point? Albert Einstein, he said also he didn't believe in miracles either, or prayer. He answered a letter written to him by a little girl asking him if he believed in prayer. He said, scientific research is based on the idea that everything that takes place is determined by the laws of nature. For this reason, a research scientist will hardly be inclined to believe that events could be influenced by a prayer. In other words, by a wish a wish addressed to a supernatural being. So the whole idea of prayer is thought to be worthless from a naturalistic perspective. However, in recent times, in 2019, this well-known philosopher, David Gerlitner, he said, beauty is important. He's talking about the theory of evolution. He says it's a beautiful theory in that it explains a lot. He said, beauty is often a telltale sign of truth. Beauty is our guide to the intellectual universe, walking beside us through the uncharted wilderness, pointing us in the right direction and keeping us on track most of the time. And he says, well, this is the reason why Darwinian evolution was accepted, because it makes sense. It's a beautiful theory. Again, if you're like Isaac Newton and you don't think too deeply, it makes a lot of sense. But if you think much more deeply, it doesn't make much sense. And Gerlitner goes on, he says, this was Darwin's main problem. His main problem was molecular biology. There was no such thing in his own time. We now see inside the cell what he could only see from outside. If he only knew of the theory of mobile phones evolving without there being computers or software inside, or what the digital revolution was all about, it might make sense. But when you look inside the mobile phone, you're just like, no, it didn't just evolve. Neo-Darwinism says that nature simply rolls the dice, and if something useful emerges, great. Otherwise, try again. But useful sequences are so gigantically rare that this answer simply won't work. Darwin could easily have understood that minor mutations are common but can't create significant evolutionary change, or major mutations are rare and often fatal. So this is what convinced him to be a Christian, David Gerlitner. So why did Darwin believe what he believed, and why did it make sense at his time? He was only looking on the outside of the cell phone. He never saw molecular biology. So it made sense to him because he saw changes over time. He saw all these different kinds of dogs that came from one kind of dog. He saw different kinds of peas that came from one kind of pea. All these different finches that came from one kind of finch. So it said, see, things change over time. And if you let things change far enough, you can make all these huge changes. Well, he didn't understand how the changes he saw actually happen. God created the cell phone to change in response to different cell phone needs, different environments. And so this guy, Gregor Mendel, came along and he described what was called front-loaded information, where you have the information for these changes there inside a creature ahead of time, which is just marvelous. I mean, who could make something like that would modify itself over time in response to different environments? And so Mendel described this, but Darwin didn't know anything about Mendel. Mendel knew about Darwin, but Darwin didn't know anything about Mendel. And somehow Darwin became more popular than Mendel did because Mendel's work was lost for a long time, and it was only rediscovered later. It had to do with genetic recombination. Like, this is the reason why I look different than my brother. He's dark-skinned and hairy. I told him he was adopted from the apes down in South America. But anyway, he was left on our doorstep. But it's the reason why we look different, and why our own Wesley and Bradley look very different, is because a genetic recombination can make very different offspring from the same two people, right? Same thing for dogs. The same gene pool for dogs can make all the different variety of dogs, starting with a wolf. In fact, in the last 300 years, all the modern breeds of dogs were produced from the wolf. Just 300 years. So my friends call me, you're not a creationist, you're a hyper-evolutionist. You believe these things can happen so fast. I was like, yeah, they can. They can happen very fast if you have the front-loaded information already there. But if you don't have the information there, you're not going to turn a cat into a dog, no matter how many millions of years you try. And donkeys, horses, and mules, the mule is sterile, but donkeys and horses make mule. Why is the mule sterile? Well, it's because there's a chromosome that got flipped over. It got inverted onto itself, so that when it tries to separate out, it fragments. And so that's why the mule is sterile. But the mule is not a different kind of creature. It's the same gene pool. It's just that got a chromosome inverted. Same information. Same thing for a liger. It's a combination of a lion and tiger. In fact, it's stronger, bigger, and it lives longer than either a lion or a tiger. It's called hybrid vitality. When you mix these creatures together, they kind of revert back to their original creature. They get stronger and they live longer. Pisley is a polar bear and a grizzly bear combined. So that's a Pisley bear. A Zorse is a zebra and a horse combined together. Here's the liger again. It's a huge creature. Here's a baby zorse. That's called a. Here's a zonkey. Or I'm sorry, a baby zonkey. A zebra and a donkey. This is called a peacock pheasant. This is called a chickpea, chicken and a peacock. And this one barely survived. A chicken and a turkey. Right? So some of them don't do so well, but they're still from the same gene pool of options. This is a geep, a sheep and a goat. Right? You don't want to be a geep when Jesus comes again and separates the sheep from the goats. Right? And this is a baby geep. They have different numbers of chromosomes than sheep or goats, but they're still the same gene pool because the same information is there. It's just separated in a different number of chromosomes. This is a camel. It's a camel and a llama mixed together. So you know that camels are only in Africa originally, and llamas are in South America. But you know that South America, if you look at the globe, got split away from Africa because they still fit like a puzzle, right? So once upon a time, the ancestor of llamas and camels were together, and then they split apart, but they still have the same gene pool, even though they've been separated for thousands of years, and they still can make offspring that are viable. Here's the globe where you can see that South America and Africa was once joined together like a puzzle. After the flood, they got split apart. This is a pumapard, a panther and a puma. And so where's the limit? Where's the limit for this diversification of creatures? Well, the limit is between order and family. You can't make offspring between different orders, among animals anyway. And sometimes you can go too far, right? There's no jackalope. And there's no bird cat either, right? So there's limits. There's limits to gene pools on how far they can diversify. And the limits are well known if you study it in detail. But if you extrapolate too far based on the diversification that we can see, you can get yourself into trouble. So Darwinian tree of life, where you can explain everything based on a single common ancestor, that just doesn't work. Genetically, it doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense. And there's mutational reasons, or genetic reasons, statistical reasons for that. The biblical model, where you can diversify within a gene pool, but each gene pool has limitations, boundaries where it can't go any farther, this is what makes the most sense, genetically speaking. Everything else, where you try to go beyond the boundaries, everything else pretty much goes downhill. Which came first, the fish with an eye or the fish without an eye? The fish with an eye came first. It's always the more complex that comes first. The less complex, you can lose stuff, but you can't gain stuff, is the problem. So here's a flightless bird, a cormorant, on a windy island, a Galapagos island. So which came first, this bird with tiny little wings that can't fly, or the full-winged cormorant? Which came first? The full-winged cormorant came first, and then it lost its ability to fly. This is also interesting. These scientists, Stockel and Thayer, in 2018, they found out that every species that is alive today came into existence at the same time, they say about 100,000 years ago. But even 100,000 years ago was a huge shock to them, because they didn't expect everything that exists today to have arrived on the scene, genetically speaking, at the same time. They said almost all animal species on Earth today emerged about the same time as humans. This conclusion is very surprising, unless you're Noah. And I fought against it as hard as I could. And what's interesting is they based their 100,000 time year on a supposed evolutionary relationship between humans and chimps, right? But if you use genetic relationships between known pedigrees, between known chimp pedigrees and known human pedigrees, it really boils down to about 3,000 to 6,000 years ago that everything that's alive today arrived on the scene, right? Which is very biblical, right? Because the flood happened between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago. And you're like, wow, genetically speaking, everything showed up about 4,000 to 5,000 years, or 3,000 to 6,000 years ago, about the same time the Bible says that it happened, right? So this is shocking news that's pretty recent. Also, do you know that fossilized crocodiles, more than half of them were vegetarian? They have vegetarian teeth. I don't know what crocodiles ate. Maybe they came out of the water and they found some giant watermelon, right? But why were they vegetarian? So here's their vegetarian teeth. And you know that there are vegetarian spiders even. They trap like pollen in their web and they eat. And if they get a fly in there, they clip the fly out and let it go. They won't eat the fly. They'll only eat vegetarian stuff. So if you go back farther and farther, it gets closer and closer to like the Bible describing things as ideal. Like the lion, being friends with the lamb and their young playing together and eating straw like an ox, and all these things make more sense. Because which is more complicated, a vegetarian lion or a meat-eating lion? A vegetarian lion is more complicated. It has a more complicated digestive system than a meat-eating lion. And so the current meat-eating situation where things are not all vegetarian, this is a degenerative effect. This is a decline over time from the original ideal that the Bible describes. So again, the biblical description starts to make more sense. So it's like breaking Humpty Dumpty. It's a lot easier to break Humpty Dumpty than to put him back together again. Why is that? Because there's so many different ways to break him, right? But there's only one way to put him back together where he actually works. So it's the same thing happens with biology and biochemistry. There's a lot of different ways to break a biological system so it doesn't work. But there's a very few ways to put it back together again, because everything that actually works is very widely separated on what's called sequence space. Because, everything in biology is reference to something else in sequence space. It's like stepping stones on a lake bed or a river, side of a river, where the more and more complex a system gets, the farther it is away from everything else. And how do you get to the next stepping stone? Blindfolded. You have to walk there, swim there blindfolded, and it takes exponentially longer and longer amounts of time to get there. Everything in your bodies is made out of proteins and sugars that are sequenced. And the specific sequence is what gives them function. And also the three-dimensional sequence gives them function. It's like letters in an alphabet and spelling words. And just using the English language system, the defined words versus undefined words. If you go to a Scrabble dictionary, for example, what is the ratio of defined two-letter words versus two-letter sequences? Well, it's 1 in 7. Three-letter sequences, it's 1 in 18. Seven-letter sequences is 1 in 250,000. And it just goes up exponentially from there. So it gets harder and harder and harder to find new meaningful words in English and even sentences and paragraphs and whatever as you lengthen the minimum size of the sequence. The same thing happens in biology. In fact, it's such a problem that detrimental mutations, since they're so easy to break something rather than fix something, we're all going downhill. You guys, like Dawson, you're worse off than your parents by about 100 mutations. Sorry, man. Right? They're actually better than you. Right? So we're all worse off than our parents. We're all going downhill faster than natural selection can keep up with it. In fact, just to keep up, the average woman would have to give birth to about 1 trillion children just to keep up with the detrimental mutation load that each of us gets per generation. It used to be thought that a woman could give birth to about 18 children to keep up, right? But that was about 10 years ago, and we now know it's about 1 trillion children. So good luck, right? We're just headed downhill, and we always have been. So we're eventually going to go extinct, right? So why are we still here? It's because we haven't been here very long. We've been going downhill ever since the Garden of Eden. And no one has a solution for this. And I like this little video clip, if you can put the sound. It's like explaining tornadoes building buildings. Love the little last shingle falling into place, right? But that's how you should be looking at the human body and the human immune system and the human cellular function. Even an individual cell is more complex, informationally speaking, than the entire universe, right? And so you should be saying, how can that cell just come into being by itself? You should be even more shocked than that. By looking at a single cell, it's way more complex than that. and you should all be having your mouths open like those guys. Right? It would be a miracle to explain such a thing without design, intelligent design. And so what do evolutionists say about this? Because now this information is becoming more and more overwhelming. So what do they say? And why do they hang on to naturalism so tight? Well, there's this guy, Lawrence Krauss. He tries to explain it. He wrote this book called A Universe from Nothing, to get away from God, right? How the whole universe, everything came from nothing. Absolutely nothing. It's actually not really nothing, because he starts out with a quantum computer. And this quantum computer has a giant lake in it, and the lake is making bubbles, and each bubble is a universe, right? So he's not starting with nothing, he's starting with a computer that acts like God. It can make anything it wants. The only difference between the computer and a real God is that a computer can do everything that a real God can do. The only difference is it doesn't judge you, right? It doesn't make moral judgments. So this is really interesting. So what he does, he was on this radio interview, and he says, maybe there is an externally existing multiverse that we can't observe, making many, many universes, or test scientifically. Maybe it has laws that we don't know about which allow for our universe to pop into being. Maybe this popping into being is uncaused. Who made God? Who made God? Religious people are stupid because they just assume brute facts. Religious people are against the progress of science. They don't want to figure out how things work. But naturalists like me let the facts determine our beliefs. Philosophers are stupid too. They know nothing, right? Only physicists, evidently, right? So the radio interview asked him a series of interesting questions. He says, do you see any evidence of purpose in the universe? Krauss said, well, maybe I would believe if the stars all lined up and spelled out a message from God. Like, hey, Krauss, this is God just stopping by to say hi, right? Then he would believe, right? And so Howard Brierley is this radio host was very clever. I have to hand it to him. He said, actually, no, that would not be evidence for God from your multi-universe view. If there is an infinite number of universes existing for an infinite amount of time, then anything can happen, no matter how unlikely it is. Therefore, no evidence could convince you that God exists, since the unobservable, untestable, eternal multiverse can make anything it wants, right? It's like, man, that guy's on top of it, right? In other words, two-headed cows should not surprise you. 10-headed cows, nothing should surprise you, because something's going to make one of those things somewhere in the universe. Arnold Schwarzenegger winning the lottery 10 times in a row. That should not surprise you, because somewhere in the universe that's bound to happen by random chance alone, right? Nothing should surprise you. In fact, the multi-universe idea undermines the basis of testability and science itself, because there is no falsifiability. You can't be wrong when you have a multi-universe idea, no matter what crazy idea you say, right? So how is Lawrence Krauss going to answer this observation? So sometimes you're trapped into a corner and you could become very honest, right? So this is what he said. He said, that's a true statement. I was like, well, he admits it, right? He said, and very convenient for atheists who don't want to be accountable to God, don't you think? You talk about this God of love and everything else, but somehow if you don't want to believe in him, you don't get any of the benefits. So you have to believe. Then if you do anything wrong, you're going to be judged for it. I don't want to be judged by God, and that's the bottom line, right? I don't want to be judged by God, and that's the bottom line. It has nothing to do with science. It has nothing to do with evidence. It has to do with judgment, right? That's why he avoids God as much as possible. And anything that points to God or might point to God, even stars lining up saying, hey, Krauss, this is God stopping by to say hi, he would reject that too. If someone were raised from the dead, like Jesus said, it wouldn't matter. Because if you reject the evidence that Moses and the prophets, you'll reject anything, right? You're determined to reject God for reasons that you want to do what you want to do, and you don't want anybody telling you that that's wrong. That's what Lawrence Krauss admits to himself personally, right? And you know what? We're all in the same boat. We're all going to face judgment. So why are we here in this church today? Why do we even give God any time of day whatsoever? Because we're all going to face judgment, and none of us are going to pass judgment, right? So what's interesting about here is the Bible gives an amazing statement. It says judgment is given in favor of the saints. Who here is a saint? Oh, somebody's brave enough. This is the funny thing. Are saints like perfect people? No. Saints are as bad as I am, right? Which is pretty bad, right? The thing about saints are the people who give their dirtiness and their brokenness and their problems into the hands of God. That's what makes a saint. Say, God, I am totally out of line. I am totally broken, cannot fix myself, terrible person. It's like the man who beat on his chest and said, forgive me, have mercy on me, a sinner, right? Said that man went home justified. Why? Because he gave up. He gave his brokenness to God and allowed God to fix him, right? And so that's what makes a saint. When you give up and you admit it, you say, I am not going to pass this judgment. I am broken, and without you, I'm lost, right? That's what makes a saint. As soon as you do that, you enter sainthood. You can be sainted, as the Catholics call it, or whatever. And so it's really interesting that we don't have to worry about judgment because Jesus already took it, right? Jesus took judgment for us. He admits it. Yeah, terrible people, awful, terrible, terrible people. But I've already taken care of that, right? And if you just put yourself into my hands, I'll take care of you too. Right? So we don't have to worry about judgment. So I watched, and this horn, remember that little horn that waged war against the saints? He was prevailing against them. He was beating them up, right? Saying, you're terrible people, and we were all saying, yep, we are, right? So he was winning until the Ancient of Days arrived, and he pronounced judgment in favor of the saints of the Most High. And he told the little horn to shut up, right? He said, look, I've already taken care of it. We all agree these people are terrible people, but that's not the point. I've taken care of it. At that time, and the time came for them to take possession of the kingdom. So we're going to give the kingdom, we're going to get the kingdom even though we don't deserve it. Judgment is going to be given into our favor even though we don't deserve it. Right? So we don't have to worry about judgment. The just will live by faith. This was the battle cry of the Reformation. It said, from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been subjected to violence, and violent people have been raiding it. This text doesn't mean what you think it means. It means desperate people, right? It's been subject to desperate people, and desperate people have been raiding it, is what it really means. It says Gill's exposition. I like this description of this text. Desperate sinners who were under violent apprehensions of wrath and vengeance of their own lost and undone state and conditioned by nature were violently in love with Christ and eagerly desirous of salvation by him and communion with him, and had their affections set upon the things of another world, these having the gospel preached to them, which is a declaration of God's love to sinners, a proclamation of peace and pardon, and the publication of righteousness of life by Christ. They greedily catched onto it and embraced it. Are you desperate? Are you violently seeking after salvation? Right? How bad do you want it? Right? So, I want it pretty bad. I don't know about you. But if God wants me, as bad as I am and as bad as I've been, and if he wants to fix me, have at it. I'm yours. Right? Amen.